back or what?
Where's my paper? Our speaker for this afternoon has a long and varied career as an engineer, a physicist, a professor, Methodist minister, and a life where faith and science coexist in harmony. John Wilson has a pocket full of degrees. He has a Ph.D. degree in particle physics from the University of Houston, a Master of Science in Physics from Drexel Institute of Technology, a Master of Theological Studies from Perkins at SMU, a Master of Science degree in Industrial Management from Purdue University, and a Bachelor of Science degree in Electrical Engineering at the University of Tennessee, where he tells me he was a debater. Okay. He's a member of the American Physical Society, the American Association of Physics Teachers, and the Institute on Religion in an Age of Science. He's currently teaching physics at Sam Houston State University in Huntsville. Prior to this, he served as an assistant research professor in particle physics at the University of Houston, professor of physics at Houston Community College, and adjunct professor of physics at the University of St. Thomas. Beyond his particle physics experience here, Dr. Wilson has served as fellow at the University of St. Thomas Center for Faith and Culture, where he organized events for the center and brought in many really outstanding speakers in the field of faith and science. He's also served as associate pastor for evangelism at St. Luke's United Methodist Church. The title for Professor Wilson's talk today is Reflections on Hope and Authentic Religion. Please give him a warm welcome.
Thank you, Dr. Graham. It's a delight to be here and to visit with you all and share. When Dr. Graham and I first talked about this talk, I just finished reading Polkinghorne's book on hope, and I also just finished some discussion regarding Christ's comments in the back of the Gospel of John. And so I sort of had an idea of what I wanted to talk about. And then I gave John an abstract, but then when I got into it, it changed. And so it has changed somewhat. Hope is the biggest thing I think that we worry about, particularly end-of-life concerns, and that's where I want to go. First, though, I want to talk a little bit about religion.
John, could we turn on your sound system?
I did turn it on.
Oh, did we? Yeah, it is. Okay. Okay, I'll take care of it from here.
You know, I am an electrical engineer.
Sounds like
I got it. I got it figured out.
Now it's on now. Why don't we start all over?
You good?
Okay, I would like to talk about hope today. And the first subject I want to talk about is death. Carl Jung has made numerous statements, one of which was, he said all of his patients over 40 suffered from some aspect of meaningless in their lives. The one I want to concern myself with today, though, is he said almost everyone over 40 had some sort of concern about death. John Bradshaw says something similarly in his work, 8 Stages of Man. He argues that if we don't deal with our mortality in our 40s, we don't ever deal with it. In my opinion, most of the people that I come in contact with in my age group, and we're certainly senior citizens, have a concern about that. The question is, how does religion address that? And first of all, what is religion? Anthropologists tell us that we first danced our religion. And then eventually, religion emerges in dance and in celebration, and in ceremonies regarding death. So that involves primitive religion. The religions developed from the 1700s, the ones that we know about today: Hinduism, Judaism, Confucianism, Taoism, Buddhism, and so forth. Some of these religions are philosophical. However, they do address the ultimate concerns of the culture. The ultimate concerns of the culture are the concerns for humanity. How do we relate? How do we get along? Confucius develops his philosophy based on relationship. And he had 5 considerations of relationship. However, I want to focus more specifically on what William James says in his well-known book, Religion, therefore, as I now ask you arbitrarily to take it, shall mean for us the feelings, acts, and experiences of individual men in their solitude so far as they apprehend themselves as to stand in relationship to whatever they consider the divine. Now, I don't think we need to consider that in solitude. However, it does somewhat agree with Karl Rahner's aspect of the anonymous Christian. It also agrees with what Pope Pius IX said at the end of the 19th century, when they acknowledged that people found God outside the Catholic Church. And Vatican II also supported that. Rahner, like so many of us, could not understand how a loving, caring, faithful God who created not only the world, but humankind, could not care about all humankind and could only limit care to a small group of people. Today, we're just getting rid of the myth of progress. The myth of progress emerges in the 19th century. In Enlightenment thought, it has secular thought, in the 17th century, it has secular thought in the 19th century with Marx and the classless society. Today, Melior argues, and so does Polkinghorne, that the events of the 20th century, the Holocaust, nuclear war, terrorism, and the possibility of global warming seem to eradicate the myth of progress. And I agree with that. However, the concern of hope has absolutely nothing to do with progress. It has to do with the ultimate. So, are we concerned about hope? Are we concerned about meaning? Ernst Bloch wrote The Principle of Meaning. He's a neo-Marxist. He is Jewish, strong Jewish. He practiced by the Kabbalah instead of the Torah. Here he talks about utopia. That's not what we're talking about today. We're not talking about some sort of wish, some sort of desire that materializes in some sort of utopia. Viktor Frankl, Man's Search for Meaning, he talks about logotherapy from his experiences in the concentration camps in World War II, where he acknowledges that meaning sustains our life. Catherine Tanner agrees with that. Catherine Tanner agrees that we cannot live a meaningful life, a fruitful life without meaning. But that's not what we're talking about in terms of hope. Harold Kushner talks about that in his book, When All You Ever Wanted Isn't Enough, in his study of Ecclesiastes. Ecclesiastes is a very interesting book. It's read every year at the Feast of Tabernacles in the Jewish community. The Feast of Tabernacles is a celebration of things that don't last. However, that's still not what we're talking about when we talk about hope. Instead, we're talking about theological hope. We're talking about hope beyond this life, in the hope of a faithful and loving God. Jurgen Moltmann talks about that in his 1965 book on hope. John Polkinghorne in his more recent book, The God of Hope and the End of the World. And then Bishop Wright, the Anglican bishop, in Surprised by Hope. All three of these men share similar thoughts regarding hope, and that's what we'll talk about today. First, the question is, does religion matter? Religion matters if it makes a difference, if it's more than a philosophy. If your religion is nothing but a philosophy, and Blaise Pascal makes the comment, there are things that the heart knows that the reason cannot grab. And so if your religion has been taken into you and is a part of your heart, it does make a difference. It makes such a strong difference that you and I, when our religious thought is challenged, It challenges our stability. I'm convinced the sun will come up tomorrow. If the sun does not come up tomorrow, I'm in trouble. I'm convinced that my God will be there for me. If somehow that is challenged, then my whole faith and my whole way of life is challenged. So religion, my religion, and I'm sure yours does, matters. Does religion make a difference? Religion makes a difference. Unfortunately, it tends to be a cultural difference. We see that religions are very culturally organized. They guide the culture. The religions emerge out of the culture, and the culture is deciding how it wants to govern itself, how it wants to relate to each other. And unfortunately, there are difficulties when we try to move from one culture to another. And notice I'm not picking on a particular religion. I'm sticking with a cultural aspect of religion. It makes a difference within the culture. Somehow we need to find a way to transcend the culture so that it makes a difference across cultures. Does it empower life? Yes, I think authentic religion does empower life. What Harold Kushner says, and when all you ever wanted isn't enough, he says authentic religion encourages you to find your own path. Not only does it encourage you, but it empowers you. Jean Piaget, in the Moral Judgment of the Child, makes the comment that religion that is obedience to authority is religion for a child. So, we need to let ourselves go. We need to find our own spiritual path. That means that your path is not necessarily the same as mine. And for example, my wife's path is different from mine, and I love that because we can accept each other's path and walk our own path. So yes, it makes a difference. And I'll talk a little bit about that later when I talk about John Wesley and the Moravians. Unfortunately, we live in a technocratic world, a world governed by science. Today, the scientist has become the prophet of 2,000 years ago. Today, if we want to know something about our world, we go to the scientists. We go to the biologists. They tell us how long we're going to live. They tell us everything about our life, except, as Francisco Ayala says, they don't answer the meaningful questions. The meaningful questions are, why am I here? Why is there something instead of nothing? What is the ultimate purpose behind all that exists? Science only deals with the material. Theology deals with the metaphysical, with the important question. John Polkinghorne makes the observation. Science, particularly biology, tends to see the world mechanistically. He makes the point, if you see the world mechanistically, then Beethoven's symphonies are nothing but vibrations. And we know that they're far more than vibrations to you and me. Hope emerges in the Abrahamic religions. Hope emerges, and I always love that situation in Cain and Abel, when God comes to Cain after Abel has died and tells Cain that he'll be banished, and Cain cries, "What will I do without you?" That says it all as far as I am concerned, and that is the entire historical aspect of the Abrahamic religions. God shows up. We realize that things matter when God is present, and things do not work when God is not. God shows up again in the 3rd chapter of Exodus. And here I think we need to revisit our understanding of God. In the seminaries we talk about God as being immutable, meaning that God is not changeable, and I agree with that. God does not change. The problem with that is that it tends to make us think that God does not relate to us, that God is just out there watching what's going on. And that is not true in the 3rd chapter of Genesis, 3rd chapter of Exodus. God shows up to Moses and he says, "I have heard the oppression of my people." And for the first time, we know that God cares about what's going on here and now. Judaism is a historical religion, as is Christianity. By that we mean it's established based on historical events, not based on philosophical reasoning. Next we have God shows up again. Shows up in the incarnation, in the person of Jesus Christ. Jesus makes the announcement in the first chapter of Mark, repent, for the kingdom of heaven is at hand. This, I believe, is an eschatological statement, because the Greek there says the kingdom is beginning to make itself felt in the world. Jesus says later on in the Gospels to the disciples, there will be many of you standing here who will not taste of death until you see the Son of God coming in the kingdom. So I believe, as does Moltmann, as does Wright, and does Polkinghorne, that eschatology begins then and continues. You and I are in the eschatological moment now. What that means is God is present with us, God goes on before us, and we all stream in the eschatological moment. And I'll talk a little bit more about that when I talk about eschatology. I want to talk about hope in John Polkinghorne. John Polkinghorne is highly Christological. He loves the Johannine Gospel. He loves the Pauline Corpus. He loves the Colossians 1 text, the Romans 8 text, all the strong Christological texts. He is in his series on the Advent, he talks seriously about the Incarnation. The Incarnation, just like God's creation, meant that God chooses to limit himself. That's what we mean by canonicism. Canonicism means that God has given up some of himself in order that you and I can have the freedom to choose. Polkinghorne calls it potentiality. Kushner says that we have the potential to be the most that we can be. He says that when God goes to Abraham and says, follow me and be righteous, that could very well be looked at, go and be the most that you can be. So in order to do that, and when my children were growing up, we realized as they got older, we had to give them more and more freedom. So when they left high school and went out on their own, they were already running their lives. So in a sense, that was a kenotic act on my part. So God, in his kenotic act, gives me my freedom to make my choices. I have the freedom to follow him or not to follow him. Unfortunately, look what happens. Jesus announces in Luke, here he is asked to read from the scroll of Isaiah. He reads the scroll of Isaiah, and he announces that I have come to give liberty and to eliminate blindness and to relieve oppression. In other words, he has come just as God said he was concerned in the 3rd chapter of Exodus. Jesus has come to relieve the world of its cares and its concerns. Unfortunately, in his ministry, that's his entire ministry. The world doesn't seem to understand it. In Mark, the disciples never understand it in Mark. And that's the famous Mark and the Secret. They don't. The Pharisees don't understand it. And the reason they don't understand it is because their power is being abused. In Oscar Wilde's play Salome, there's this wonderful scene where Herod has heard that Jesus is raising the dead. And he says, I won't allow that. No one can raise the dead. His power is threatened. And he asks the courier, where is he? And the courier says, he is everywhere, but he cannot be found. And that is the story that leads right up to the crucifixion. God was there, and God could not be found. I think we make a mistake as Protestants and I'll criticize my own denomination for this, in discarding Christ from the cross so fast. Protestants love that. In my home, I have Dowley's sketch for his Christ of St. John. It sits right, it's a big one, it's this big, it sits right at the end of my sofa. And I see that every day. It reminds me every day that Christ was crucified. Why is that important? It reminds me that God suffered. Why is that important? It reminds me that God understands my suffering. Elie Wiesel, in his work, Night, from his experience in the concentration camp, talks about this situation where they hung this young boy on a tree. And they're all gathered around there, and they're looking at this, and someone in the crowd says, "Where is God?" And someone else says, "He's there hanging on the tree." Moltmann says, God was in Auschwitz. God was in the towers in 9/11. God is in all the horrific events that you and I can imagine. If you and I discard Jesus too fast from the cross, we forget that. You and I too fast want to get to a theology of glory. You and I too fast want to get rid of pain. You and I do not like pain. However, as Kushner says, if you become good at avoiding pain, you sometimes become good at avoiding joy, all feelings. You and I need to be able to live in that, and I'll talk about what enables us to do so in a minute. After the crucifixion, the resurrection, and we'll have celebrate that on Easter, at the end of next week. What's interesting about the resurrection is that Jesus makes all these interesting appearances. He appears behind Mary Magdalene as a gardener. He shows up on the road to Emmaus. He shows up to the beloved disciples. He seems to go through walls and doors. He seems to appear and disappear. He seems to have a body that is not like the body he had before he was crucified. What's important, though, is, I think, because it starts with the 14th chapter of John, Jesus is concerned about reassuring his disciples because he knows what's going to happen. He makes that real clear in the 14th chapter. He says, "I go to prepare a place for you that where I am, there you may be also." And then when Philip questions him about that and says, "Show us the Father," he says, "He who has seen me has seen the Father." He mentions the coming of the Holy Spirit 5 times from that 14th to the 17th chapter of John, and the different aspects of the Holy Spirit. And I'll talk about that a little bit more. But the important point is that God cares about you and me, wants to reassure you and me when we are in difficulty. Eschatology. Eschatology, if you read the 15th chapter of 1 Corinthians, which is the chapter that's often read at funerals and often misunderstood, 15th chapter of Corinthians talks about your and my having a new body. The word there, in the Greek word there, psyche, is not a new physical body, not even a new spiritual body, but is a new body of some kind of matter that we don't know. And Polkinghorne goes out and he says, God will create us out of a new matter that totally does not exist now. So that our experience will be transformation from where you and I are now to where you and I are in intimate relationship with God. To be in heaven with God means to be in intimate relationship. You cannot understand that unless you understand intimacy. I have wonderful experiences of intimacy in my marriage from time to time. They don't happen all the time because you and I misunderstand what intimacy are. Intimacy is when I know that my wife is telling me something about herself deep down. And I know that's the time to keep my mouth shut. Right?
Right.
But see, you and I will be in an intimate relationship with God like that. That's what it means. God stood alongside. God was there. God stands alongside, stood alongside then, stands alongside now, and throughout. I love the second beatitude. Although I don't like the fact they use, translate Makarios as blessed. I prefer, oh, how happy are they? Because I think that's what Jesus is talking about in the kingdom. But the second beatitude is, oh, how happy are they that mourn. Why? They shall be comforted. The word for comfort there is parakaleo in the Greek. The first meaning is comfort. The second meaning is to call to one's side. The impact of the kingdom is that you and I can call God to our side at any instant and know that He stands there, know that He is in tune and understands what we're going through. And I would argue that He suffers with us. Christian hope. This would be a Pollyannish talk if I did not talk about evil and suffering. There's no doubt that the death of a loved one is a painful experience for everyone involved. There's no doubt that going through serious terminal illness is a painful experience. And I don't want to demean that. I don't want to indicate that there's anything that's not serious about that. Because God has limited Himself in His activities in the world, has given you and me the freedom that we have, has given the potential of the world for fertility, that ultimately ends up in experiences that are not what we would choose for some of us. John Hick points out, he makes a couple statements. First, he points out, he quotes Hume on this. He says, Hume talks about water and rain. Rain falls, it makes the grass grow, the corn grows, the plants grow, everything thrives. When we have too much rain, everything dies. So the world has been made as it is, and it has its limitations. Christian hope rests in nothing except the resurrection. I'm speaking to a group in Huntsville in a few weeks, and one of the persons in the group made the point to me that he does not believe that Jesus was crucified, that Jesus was resurrected, and I expect he will ask me that question at the end of the talk. My response to him will be, well, you got to throw out all the got to throw out the Pauline corpus. You have to throw out the entire New Testament. Otherwise, Paul's statement in Galatians 2:20 means absolutely nothing when he says, I am crucified with Christ, and the life that I now live, I live through the faith of the Son of God who died for me. And it'll be interesting to see what his comment, because I don't think he's thought about that. Christian hope rests in trust in a loving and faithful God. You and I believe that God is faithful, He's loving, and He's caring. The historical record shows that. From His appearance in Genesis, from His appearance in Exodus, from His constant appearance through the spoken word of the prophets, through the New Testament record, through the tradition of the church, we know that God is there. Biblical record, we already talked about the Exodus. One of the things I think we need to recover is the expectancy that the presence of Jesus Christ in our lives makes a difference. Our faith must be much more than the recitation of the creeds on Sunday morning. Must be much more than going and reciting the psalms or singing the hymns. It must be an experience of the presence of God where you and I know that that presence makes a difference. And it made a big difference when Jesus goes from the River Jordan to Bethany to raise Lazarus. When he's coming up the hill towards Bethany, Martha sees him and runs out, and Martha says, Lord, if you had been here, there was an expectancy for Martha that the presence of Jesus Christ made a difference. Soon Mary comes out. Mary says the same thing. Your and my pastoral concern is to have our people recover that expectancy that the presence of God makes a difference in our lives. The Pauline corpus. Pauline corpus, I've already said, is highly Christological. I love the first chapter of Colossians. I love it when Paul says that everything was made through and for him, and Jesus Christ in the beginning. This tells me that he's the glue that holds your and my lives together. When you and I get to the position that that's a part of us, then it makes a difference. The promise, I've already commented on the promise, parakaleo. The 17th chapter of John is the high priestly prayer of John. The prayer we talk about is the Lord's Prayer, and I think we should spend more time on the 17th chapter of John. It's a beautiful prayer. When Jesus prays for his disciples, not to take them from the world, but to keep them from the world. I have no reason to believe that Jesus did not pray that same prayer for me today. Piety. Piety. I chose to use the word piety rather than spiritual. Someone will come up to me sometimes and say, I'm not religious, I'm spiritual. I have no idea what that means. And I don't want to discount that. I think religion is several things. It's spirituality, it's soteriology, concern for humanity. It's got the other two things, but it's that's one of the. Yes, I know. I'm proud of being a senior with limited memory. 1735, 1736. John and Charles Wesley left England for Georgia. And they were sailing across the sea, and on the way they encountered a storm, and the mainmast broke on the ship. And John was immensely frightened. On board, though, there was this group of Moravians, and they were just as calm as can be. And John had learned a bit of German so he could communicate with them, and he asked them, why aren't you afraid? And they explained that to him. And John went on to Georgia. When he came back, he had the same experience again. It was now 1738, May of 1738. He's reading. It's being read in the service, the Luther's introduction to the book of Romans. And John finds his heart warmly moved. And all of a sudden, John is free from all his anxieties that he's been riddled with for years. He's an Anglican priest, and he doesn't know whether he's a Christian. He writes to his mother about that. And all of a sudden, and he goes to Germany, gets involved with Moravians and Count Zinzendorf, and that is an immense turnaround for John Wesley, spiritually. I love St. John of the Cross. I'm an independent cuss. I don't really go with the crowd, so that's why I left the corporate world. I'm not a corporate guy. I'm just me. And so when I went through spiritual formation in seminary, and they were telling me how to be spiritual, that just did not resonate with me. Well, I've had Dowley's picture of Christ of St. John probably for 30 or 40 years. I've had several pictures. I thought it was Salvador Dali's depiction of John in the Gospel. And all of a sudden, several years ago, I pick up, thanks to Bob Hessen, the Christ of St. John, and I'm reading this, and all of a sudden I'm finding that I G-haul. G-haul is a term you use in Tennessee when you say to the mules, G-haul, and they get up. I G-haul with this guy. I resonate because guess what speaks to him? Scripture. What is always spoken to me is Scripture. And I come halfway through the book and there's this picture. I said, my goodness, that's Christ of St. John. And that started me on a practice, a contemplative practice, which was life-changing. I'm somewhat anal, I'm somewhat compulsive, disorder. I have probably all the disorders. You know, you could spend your entire time just working with me. So I worry a lot. My wife doesn't worry because I do enough for both of us. When I started this, all of a sudden, my life just calmed down. So that's why I mentioned piety. Not to advocate for Christ of St. John, but to advocate for you to find your way into intimate relationship with God, so that when your time comes, when you're facing difficulties, you have someone to stand alongside you. Eventually, you will be confronted with the question of hope. If you're a physician, it may be a patient, maybe a family member. If you're a pastor, maybe a member of your congregation. And you have to ask how you will answer that question. I'm not going to tell you how to answer it. I'm going to tell you how I would answer it. I don't know how I would answer it. Each situation is unique. I had a close friend of mine who went through radiation treatment, and I went and I sat with him. And that's all I needed to do. Nicholas Walterstorff, in his book, Lament for a Son, talks about losing his son to a motorcycle accident in his 20s. And he says, don't tell me he'll be all right. Don't tell me he's in a good place. Just come and sit with me on my morning bench. Paul says this in the 8th chapter of Romans, I am convinced that neither death nor life nor principalities nor anything else can separate us from the love of God in Christ Jesus. I thank all of you for your attendance. It's been wonderful to share these thoughts with you. It's been a wonderful experience, and I'll be happy to answer any questions that you have.
Thank you. You are, okay, you're very Christian. How can you handle people of other faith? Or is that your issue? I mean, can you even address the hope that others might find?
I think everyone has to find their own hope. And you'll notice that in my discussion of religion, I did not compare Christianity with another religion. I did not say another religion is good, bad, or indifferent. In fact, what I did say was Karl Rahner acknowledged, and so did Pope Pius, that God speaks to a lot of people outside the church. We don't know how that is. We do know it happened historically in the Judeo-Christian record. So I believe, Dr. Graham, that God speaks to you wherever you are. And you choose to either listen or not to listen to that voice.
Great. Beautiful. Thank you.
You have a question?
Could you address who John Polkinghorne is? Because I know he's in your same field. Would you speak of him, but would you talk a little bit about him?
John Polkinghorne was a particle physicist. He was an Anglican. He's written 39 books. I've read all of them. I literally have thousands of pages of notes. It's interesting to watch him because he went to seminary at 50. I went to seminary at 57. No, I was 60. I went to seminary. So it was 2001, 61, about almost 62. So we're somewhat similar in where we were. I'm a little retarded, so I didn't get there as fast as he did. He was a particle physicist. He was a professor at Cambridge, well recognized. His book on quantum mechanics is still in print today. At 50, he had the call to go into the Anglican priesthood, and he chose it. He and his wife, Rose, I believe was her name, were married. They met in Cambridge, were married. They both went to Cambridge. Both were technical people. She, as I recall, was a mathematician. He got out of seminary, was ordained as a deacon, then as a priest, then had a parish for several years, then went back to Cambridge as a principal of one of their colleges, retired from there, won the Templeton Prize several years ago. Templeton Prize is bigger than the Nobel Prize, it's £1 million. What was interesting to me is to watch his spiritual path. His first book, and he acknowledges this in his biography. He acknowledges he grew up in a strong Anglican church where they didn't talk about how they felt about religion. They knew everybody was faithful, they just didn't talk about it. And I get that impression in his first book. He's explaining to his colleagues in science why he's going into the priesthood. But he never says what God means to him, what it means to him to be a Christian. It's an intellectual thing. And then when you come to his biography, all of a sudden that just comes out. You have a sense that he's highly Christological. When he writes his series on Advent, you see he's a strong Trinitarian. You don't get a feel for the man until that comes out. So but what fascinated me was when I came to the back of his biography, his 3 favorite texts were also my 3 favorite texts. And my life through seminary has been somewhat similar. I've grown immensely through the seminary practice. Not only have I grown, but I think my wife and I have grown a lot together, both spiritually. One thing I did not say, which I would like to have said when I was talking about suffering. Suffering, I think, is the experiences that you and I remember. We don't remember the good times. I shared that Sunday. The experience I remember with my father was when my father had a stroke. And October 6th, 1986, I guess it was. And I went to Chattanooga to be with him and stay with him for a week. And I was in the room getting ready to leave him. And he said to me, "I know how you must feel, because I was with my father in Vanderbilt Hospital in the same circumstances." So for the first time, my father shared a real, well, it wasn't free, she shared intimate moments, but a real intimate moment. And we brought him to Houston. And I remember taking him to the restaurant out in Fondren. I can't recall the name. It's a well-known restaurant in Fondren here in Houston for Thanksgiving. And he was catheterized. And he could joke about it. He was partially paralyzed. He was going through rehab. And I excused myself, and I came back and said, "Well, I went while you were gone." So he had a laughter about that. Mm. However, I remember more about those circumstances. And you know, my wife and I have a wonderful marriage. However, it's not been an uneventful marriage. And being married to me is definitely not uneventful. And I look at the times that have brought us together are the times when we've had to face difficulty. And they've brought us together. I don't like the fact that some people make the claim in the conservative side that God uses these things for us to grow. I don't like that, because that does not say what I think God is like. But I do acknowledge that you and I grow through the difficult times, or we can run away from them. A person that certainly has grown through difficulty, Stephen Hawking, got Lou Gehrig's disease when he was getting his Ph.D. He could have given up, and he did not. There was a famous baseball player who encountered some sort of serious illness, I think 20 years or so ago. He committed suicide. So all of us face things differently. That was more than you asked, John.
No, it's very good. Thank you. Yeah.
Did you think of your question?
Oh, I got so interested in something you were going on. I was trying to make a note. You said authentic religion is. You remember what you said?
Authentic religion empowers you to find your own path to
Okay,
God.
yes, all right, good.
It does not tell you what the
Yeah,
path
all right,
is.
all right, good.
That also ties in with Jean Piaget's statements in The Moral Judgment of a Child. So a religion that says if you do this, and do that, you will get there is not going to get you there. The religion that says, here it is, you go find it, is the one. And for me, I'm a great fan of the Myers-Briggs personality series. I'm a strong introvert, and I finally realized that when I was in my 40s. I guess 50, 40s, late 40s, 50s. And I realized that I was a best match for another introvert. And so my wife's an introvert. I asked her to take the Myers-Briggs when we started dating. And people laugh when I tell that. And first 6 months of dating, we'd go somewhere and didn't have anything to say. It's a wonderful marriage. Absolutely wonderful marriage. Because we have similar paths. So I recognize, even though we're introverts, she's a processor, and I'm an achiever. So she loves processing.
You would have never known.
And I've got to get to the goal. So I love her path. It's different from mine. So that's what Kushner's saying. Your path is different. Find your path and follow it.
Where'd you go to seminary?
Perkins at SMU. And that was life-changing.
Were you here and went, just left to go to seminary? Did you go full-time or just piecemeal?
Perkins has a program here, and you have to do the last 24 hours on campus. So I would fly up after class, early afternoon, take 2 courses, and fly back at 10 o'clock. And I'm working on a doctorate at SMU in theology right now. And this will be the subject of the doctorate.
Another word I would like you to open up a little bit is eschatology. Would you define it? I don't think we defined it, just so that would be on record.
Eschatology is normally defined as the theology of the end times or the last things. That, unfortunately, gets caught up and puts it way off there. What Moltmann and Polkinghorne and Wright are arguing is eschatology is the times that started with the coming of Christ. The word eschatology comes from the word eschaton. Eschaton means a distinct change in the way that God interacts. Unfortunately, interacts with the world. Unfortunately, this gets picked up by John Nelson Darby in the early part of the 18th century. He was a Plymouth Brethren. He was an Irish Anglican priest. He left the Anglican priesthood because he got upset with England that they did not intervene in the Protestant Catholic politics at the time. He then said that the entire church was irredeemable and formed his New Testament church. And a part of that was he said that all prophecy must be fulfilled. So he went back and he examined the seventh chapter of Daniel, and Daniel 7 through 12 are considered eschatological chapters and Jewish eschatology. He went back and looked at those prophecies. He then tied them in with 1 Thessalonians, which is the eschatological passage in Paul's work, and with Revelation. And he develops this exotic, dispensational, millenarian view of eschatology. It becomes a futurist event. It becomes not only a futurist event, but it becomes an event that is fearful. So the people now in eschatology, which appears in Hal Lindsey's The Great Planet Earth, Tim LaHaye's The Left Behind series, is an eschatology of fear instead of an eschatology of celebration. Notice what I said? I said eschatology is God is with me now and goes on before me. It does not discount Jesus is coming again. It goes away. Now, Craig Hill, in his book, In God's Time, Walter Brueggemann, in The Prophetic Imagination, they talk about prophecy. In my view, and Brueggemann says, a prophet is someone who speaks metaphorically of the events today. In my view, John Polkinghorne is a modern-day prophet. In a sense, I'm speaking prophetically, not because I'm a prophet. But the Left Behind series, the John Nelson Darby series, is a misunderstanding of the prophetic. Craig Hill points out, when you look at the prophecies, they're the most accurate with respect to events that immediately preceded them and events right after. The apocalyptic, and apocalyptic is a part of this, apocalyptic was language that was highly symbolic. That develops in late Judaism. The book of Revelation, John, is an apocalyptic work. That is in the late part of the New Testament. I've forgotten the exact date for that, but it's the late part. Moltmann thinks, I don't say what Moltmann thinks, I believe that it was written to those who were suffering at that time to assure them that they would get through the suffering. Not some prophetic event that the beast would be some guy in the 20th century or some guy or some woman in the 21st century. So when you and I read Revelation, I think it's much stronger to read it as a word of assurance to you and me in difficult times. And again, it ties in with the whole theology of hope. This is why I think, Dr. Graham, that the Left Behind series misses an opportunity. Hal Lindsey never talks about the cross. Important theologians over time. Luther wrote his Theology Crucis, which is his theology of the cross. Karl Barth was very adamant about theology of the cross. Not only was Karl Barth adamant about that, but Karl Barth said that Christianity is eschatology, and eschatology is Christianity. Without eschatology, you don't have Christianity. Paul Tillich agreed with that. And I agree with that.
Okay. So God suffers. Can you explain that? Because there's one thought. He's omnipotent, omniscient. He has all power. Why in the world would he allow himself or his incarnate son to suffer?
In my experience as a father, I was all powerful. I fed my children. I told them what to do, told them what schools to go to, and they did that. Worst experience I had, first worst experience was when Shannon went to the doctor to get 2 stitches in her eye and almost passed out. Second worst experience I had was when my oldest daughter went through a divorce. I suffered. That had absolutely nothing to do with my omnipotence. An omnipotent person is someone who does not feel, someone who does not care, someone who is not involved. And yes, it is difficult to understand all these terms about God and understand. However, if God is not immutable, if God is not mutable, not immanent. If God is not immanent, then why do I pray? If God does not care, why do I pray? You and I believe that. God cares, and you and I believe that. And that implies that he suffers with me. It does not imply it changes him. I did not change when my children suffered.
Good. Very good. Any other questions? Thank you, John, for being with us.
Thank you. I've enjoyed being here. It's been great. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.